In 2022, a video surfaced of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky telling his soldiers to surrender to Russia and lay down their arms. In turn, a different video emerged of Putin declaring martial law. Both videos were detected as deepfakes only after going viral on social media. This new domain for misinformation to spread is a threat to national security. In her aptly named scientific study, As Good as a Coin Toss, Horizon Fellow Di Cooke joins us today to walk us through the murky world of deepfakes and the countermeasures that should be prioritized to mitigate the dangers posed by weaponized synthetic media. I'm Dr. Kathleen McInnis, and this is Smart Women, Smart Power. This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women. Welcome to the podcast, Di. We've been talking about your work for so long. Yeah. I participated in a small way back in the day.
You did. It was much appreciated.
So I can't wait to get into the findings of your research more and your assessment of where we are in the world of deepfakes and online, like the online world's on fire kind of stuff.
It certainly feels like that sometimes.
It's a very technical term. World's on fire. On fire. But before we get started, because I'd love to know how do people get to these spaces? How people got involved in these fields? What drew you to this field?
That is a great question. So I think we'd say it starts when I ended up going back to school because I was working in finance, which was super interesting, but I think not for me long term. And I decided to go back to school and do...
Were you in New York or London?
I was in New York and then London.
Okay.
So got a big view of the finance world, which was very interesting. And said I wanted to do something different. I went back to school and almost out of a hat, I picked intelligence studies as my master's at King's College London in the War Studies department, which alumni represent. And I absolutely fell in love with it, know, and it was just so fascinating to learn about this world of, spies and lies and espionage and what the intelligence community was doing and how they did it as much as you can in a public setting, of course. But what really drew me in was we had a class on open source intelligence, the collection of all non-covert intelligence, whether that's newspapers, radio recordings, and in these days, things from the internet, on YouTube or Facebook, and how can you turn that into actionable intelligence? And we were super lucky because we had folks from Bellingcat come in, and they're really well-regarded investigative journalist organization, like Elliot Higgins, and he came and taught us himself, which was wild thinking about that now, how to conduct an open source intelligence investigation and how they did theirs. And after finishing my MA, I ended up going into a PhD on open source intelligence while also actually working open source intelligence investigations myself, which is quite cool because...
So applied and theoretical.
Exactly. Wow. And I don't think you usually see that at the same time. And so you're getting this macro view of this changing landscape while also, doing this day-to-day work that and seeing kind of what that looked like, as you said, in the applied sense with practitioners.
Do you feel like your background in finance or helped influence the way you think about these problems, or is it sort of more firewalled in your brain?
I think in some ways it's more firewalled. I would say that background has actually come more into play later in my career. Okay. So when I got very into open source intelligence, and this is around 2018, this is when AI started becoming more of a thing again. It was not just theoretical, but we're starting to see AI tools and AI data. And
it's not just a Spielberg movie.
Exactly.
It's like the real life stuff.
There we go.
I'm betraying the level of sophisticated knowledge that I have about this field.
And as a practitioner, I started seeing these AI tools, right? But there is nothing being talked about in sort of the academic research defense space at all. And I think it's because a lot of these tools were being used by people who are doing open source. They're being discovered. They're very technical. They're not being used by the IC at that time period. And so no one was talking about them in defense and intelligence. And I'm sitting there going, oh gosh, I can see how this could be so useful, all these opportunities to do better intelligence. And also things like deepfakes were just starting to really become public knowledge. And this is AI generated digital content like images, audio, text, video, things like that. And you can also see, oh gosh, how could that become so problematic for the intelligence community at large, and then also for open source investigators like myself. And so I was frantically looking around, trying to figure out where this conversation was happening because I wanted in. And it wasn't happening in the defense and intelligence space at the time, but it was happening in the AI risk and governance space.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I remember distinctly this report coming out in 2018. It was called malicious uses of AI and the risks around it. And I'm paraphrasing the title, but I was like, yes, who's written this? I'm going there, you know? And I ended up shifting actually for a couple of years over to the AI risk and governance space where I'm still in, I'd say.
Sure.
Ended up working at the Center for Governance of AI in Oxford, and then later at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk in Cambridge, just making a little tour of all the universities. And it wasn't really until a couple of years ago that the defense side of things, the defense and intelligence community, was ready to have that kind of same conversation.
Yeah.
So I've sort of now meandered back into that side of things where I was here at International Security Program as an AI fellow, and prior to that I was seconded with the UK Ministry of Defence to help with their AI strategy rollout, so thinking about how these high-level strategies and principles can be implemented in practice, you know, and as safely and securely as possible. And so it's a really interesting time for me right now because I feel like everything's finally all intersect, and we're at this crossroads where these conversations now happening in all different fronts, which is pretty cool. And this is actually, I'd say, like a cool time to be in. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Well, it's so funny, like just as a digression. So like when I was first entering the field, somebody said to me that it looks, in retrospect, like your career had this like defined trajectory, and like it was clear that you're going from here to like, which is, it's never true. You sort of like meander through, 100%. And then like in retrospect, it looks like there was like an actual path, but it's sort of like stumbling around and then being open to things, and then you know where the research or the issues take you.
This is so true, and timing I think is key for so many things, and recognizing when that timing is coming on you. So it seems much more purposeful than I think it really was at the time, which, as you said, kind of meandering and happening to have all the dominoes align.
So you talked about, you know, this perspective and this background in AI and AI governance, and how it can complicate open source intelligence investigations. But it seems that some of the work that you've been doing, and we'll get into this, like the study that you designed and the research that you're publishing in a minute, but like it is more of an actual threat, not just like this sort of complicating thing about like discerning intelligence or what an adversary is doing. It's more like this stuff can be used to destabilize societies.
Yes,
it can be used to target politicians, adversaries. We see targeting of women for, you know, with disinformation tools all the time now, unfortunately. So, what are your thoughts on how that has evolved and how quickly it's evolved?
It's evolved so quickly. You know, I mean, really, I'd say the first kind of widely publicly available models for generative AI, which is the AI that you use to create synthetic media, or colloquially known as deepfakes, only really came out between like 2016 to 2018. And it's still really nascent and very basic, right? Yeah. And so it's not that old. It's roughly 6 years or so, you know, and
6 years and like 3 lifetimes.
Honestly, it feels like that sometimes. And on one hand, it's super fast. On the other hand, you could almost see what's coming down the road from the beginning, you know, like the first well-known subreddit used for called Deepfakes, which is where we get the term, you know, was almost nearly exclusively used to create non-consensual pornography of female celebrities, you know. And so from day one, you're like, I can see how this is going to get abused, you know, and you can really easily extrapolate that to other scenarios. And it's kind of very much a canary in a coal mine situation of, well, once this technology gets easier to use and better and more realistic, how could this be used to deepfake politicians into saying or doing things they've never actually done? Or other, you know, influential figures? How could this be used to, you know, manipulate people in various ways? And how can it be used for financial fraud, which is a huge issue we're seeing over the last year and a half? Like AI voice scams are massively problematic, and that's just one of these other ways that you can more broadly see how deepfakes risk like destabilizing society at large. Jeez.
Well, so you've also, you know, designed and written up a study that can help us understand how I guess the scope of the problem is it fair to say from a psychological perspective, like you designed a perceptual study with 1,000 participants?
Almost 1,300.
1,300. Yep. Okay. Assessing how accurate people were at discerning like the real thing from a deep fake.
Yeah.
And so could you walk us through this study and its findings?
Yeah, well, the reason we decided to do it, I've wanted to do this since I learned what deepfakes were, because again, in some ways, this is a really straightforward problem. The solution is not straightforward, but how is this is going to be used in malicious ways, right? Yeah. And we need to counter this somehow. And up till now, the only defense we've had is the human observer being able to figure out the difference, which is a lot of pressure on people, especially when, they're not necessarily paying attention. Like they're not prepared for a deep fake. They're not ready for it. Yeah.
Nope.
Right. Like they're not waiting for them to appear, they come across them or they're targeted, and that makes it even harder if they're targets and there's active deception happening. But the issue we've been seeing is for ages, everyone's going, oh, well, we're going to hit this inflection point at some point where people can't tell the difference. And then it'll be huge danger. And then we'll do something. And then we need to do something, right? But like, when is that inflection point happening? And the reason we wanted to do this study was to figure out if we've hit that inflection point, because I think the assumption here is that you need to have this technology be perfectly mature and have, you can't tell the difference at all in any way, shape, or form. There are no errors, no glitches. But again, with our study, and we'll talk about this more, that's not true. It's very clear the technology doesn't need to be perfectly mature to be incredibly effective.
Right.
And so we decided to do the study.
Wait, so hang on a second. We've been, as governments and regulatory bodies, we've been waiting for the technology to become perfect at doing bad things. I think
it's less, it's waiting. There's been this expectation that once it becomes perfect, then it's going to be the real problem, and then we need to act. And it's been treating it as more of almost a future
an emerging
risk.
threat,
rather a speculative threat.
Got it.
Rather than an actual threat. And what we have seen, especially for the past year, that this is an actual threat. It's happening. There are victims today. If we think about non-consensual pornography, there's estimated to be over 1 million victims of adults and children who have fallen prey to this. We hear more and more about, financial scams using AI all the time. And I think still, though, it almost feels like there's this waiting of, well, we have to make sure this technology's got to be perfect,
Right.
And then we're going to act, we'll figure something out. Yep. And so we did this study to try to see again, well, how good are people at detecting or distinguishing between what's real and what's fake. And the results were abysmal, as you can probably guess.
I know what my results were.
So for context, we did a beta testing of the study here at CSIS, which was quite interesting, and everyone was very kind in helping us out to test it out. But on average, for the big study we did with 1,300 people between the ages of 18 to 85, which was quite cool to get representative U.S. demographics across age and gender. On average, people were about 51% correct in terms of accuracy rates for detecting synthetic media.
Did that skew with any particular age group?
That's a really good question. So we did find that older participants performed worse over time. But we found that was particularly the case for audio-based deepfakes.
Really?
Which was unexpected, yes. And they performed much, much worse at detecting audio and audiovisual deepfakes. And so we think there's a component in terms of sort of hearing degradation over time that actually affects how well you can perceive any potential artifacts, which are kind of glitches in the synthetic media when they're listening to them. But that was pretty fascinating.
Okay. Well, so based on that frankly disturbing study, and again, like I was part of that beta testing group, and I read my results, and I was like, okay, I need to be paying much more attention to this.
Yes.
What do we do about this problem?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, the first part of the study, we wanted to confirm that people can't tell the difference. They're no longer reliable. a reliable defense against this, and we really need alternative countermeasures to be put in place. And there are a lot of different measures being discussed at the moment, because there really isn't a silver bullet. There's no one.
It's like a web, right?
Protection. It's a whole of society problem, so there needs to be a whole of society solution. And there's no one single regulation or piece of tech that's realistically going to fix this.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's a lot of different discussions on different ways to do this. And so in our briefing series, which we're publishing to add some color to the study, because the study is very data heavy, and we want to build that out a bit more. We discuss 4 countermeasures that we think should be prioritized over all others, to build a more robust counter-defense against the threat of weaponized synthetic media.
Okay.
And so these span from regulatory to educational to technical, but I can give it really briefly. We talk about investing significantly more in digital media authentication technology. And so that's things like machine detection. That's things like watermarking and signatures and embedding those. It's content provenance frameworks and infrastructures. Because at the moment, while there's a lot of discussion around them, the investment in these technologies compared to actually the technology that creates deepfakes is negligible. I mean, the generative AI market is something like valued at like $1 trillion. And at the moment, that the media authentication market is negligible, is nothing, millions maybe if we're lucky.
That is budget dust.
It's a drop in the bucket. So
spend more money on
the authentication and technical solutions. The other is thinking more comprehensively on what content governance looks like throughout the AI value chain. So from the foundational models, and these are like the big models like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, and how the developers behind those can more comprehensively regulate what's allowed to be produced, and so thinking about guardrails around that more comprehensively, like making sure that people can't use it for illegal content, and then also thinking in terms of downstream developers and the fine tuners, and these are a lot like the apps and like a lot of the smaller products that do really specific things, and what their responsibility should be about trying to moderate content, because it's not just a one and done. It's a huge industry at the moment, and there's a lot of focus on the foundational models, which make a lot of sense, but there's less focus on the rest of the AI value chain. The third is trying to think through more about what comprehensive digital media authentication or education looks like for people. So it's how can we educate them on deepfakes, get them to understand how advanced they are, how problematic they are, how people are abusing them, and then also help provide them with, critical skills like cross-referencing and fact-checking and other ways to potentially try to discern if something is a deepfake that is not relying on looking or listening to it. So, and then the last is really thinking through what a comprehensive AI labeling law would look like, because that's
a labeling law.
So how like labeling and putting like a marker or something on an AI image. This is an
AI thing.
Exactly.
But if it doesn't have the appropriate label, then it's punishable or
exactly, but thinking through what that actually looks like, because right now you see, for example, the Digital Services Act, which is in the EU, they require online platforms to have labeling, of AI, and right now that's sort of happening, and you're sort of seeing it occasionally, but it's very voluntary and piecemeal. But that's not enough. You need to have a multi-level labeling to make it comprehensive, so machines can read it, not just people. You need to understand what happens when it migrates across platforms, and how do you account for that. And a lot of online platforms, particularly social media, have frameworks to moderate this content that we can tap into, like databases of prohibited content that could be linked in to make it easier to try to identify and sometimes, depending on the content itself, prohibit the adding AI.
This is we're talking about sweeping changes, not just
Huge
from
changes.
the AI side, but making our societies able to grapple with the opportunities and threats that AI presents. I mean, like the metaphor that was coming to mind that's probably not apt, but I'll say it anyways, is something about the Gutenberg Bible, right, in the printing press. Like something about how it revolutionized the way information was distributed, and therefore prompted different governments at the in that period of history to respond in all sorts of helpful and unhelpful ways, shall we say. I guess it's sort of an obvious point, but it's worth underscoring how like sweeping this is.
Yes, and I think I completely agree. I mean, I think, especially when we think about how to deal with this problem, as we were saying before, it's not just going to be one regulation that fixes it or one technical tool.
Right.
It's all of these things, and they all need to happen in concert together to reinforce one another. You know, you can't have good legislation if you don't have the technical capabilities to back it up.
Right.
Equally, trying to develop those technical capabilities and provide incentives for doing so is really hard if you don't have the regulation to push companies into doing that. You know, on the other hand, both of those things could work great. And if you're not educating people about deepfakes and making them aware of how they can be lied to, and they don't believe it, then those two first things don't even matter in the first place.
Right.
So, which makes it so tricky.
Do you think your gender as a woman has had an impact on how you approach this issue? And if so, why? If not, why not?
That's a great question. So I think my knee-jerk response would be to say no, but I think that's actually really in response to how this issue's been handled historically. And I say historically in the last 6 years, you know. But earlier on especially, it's been, deepfakes I think has been really treated as a gendered issue because predominantly it has been, consists of non-consensual pornography of women almost exclusively. I think a study came out in 2019 that said 98% of all deepfake content online was non-consensual pornography of women, you know, and that's still a huge proportion today. It's starting to diversify now, but it's a huge problem. And I think as an early researcher in the space, when I'd bring this issue up, particularly in a national security context, it would be not shut down necessarily, but almost swept aside as, oh, well, that's a woman's issue. And that whole conversation aside of a woman's issue not being a person's issue, not being a national security issue, which I don't agree with, I think the way to try to get more engagement with the conversations, especially earlier on, I tried to sort of divorce myself from it being a gendered issue at all, you know, and then therefore would want to think about myself doing this because I'm a woman. But in reality, I do think it's had an impact because you can't divorce yourself from that. And I mean, from day one, when I started seeing this pop up, all I could think of is, gosh, like, what if someone I know gets targeted by this? What if I get targeted by this, you know? Yeah. And we are seeing this happen. I mean, we've had U.S. politicians, we've had U.S. government officials, we've had powerful women from all around the world become targets of this. It's almost like, you know, it's almost all harder now not to find deepfakes of pornographic deepfakes of powerful women than, you know, to find them. So it's
when it's also sort of indicator warning, canary in the coal mine
it's
effect,
very
right?
much exactly.
So like it's a hop, skip, and a jump from those gendered oriented like non-consensual pornography to Zelensky.
Yeah, exactly.
Fakes,
I mean,
right?
it's and that's sort of how I would portray it a lot is, you know, this is a bellwether for how we can be seeing this be used in all these other different ways, you know, but then also trying to carefully deal with that gendered aspect, unfortunately. But I do think it has affected me. You know, I think that's probably one of the reasons I've initially become very viscerally interested and concerned. And then as it's gotten worse, continued to stay concerned. So.
And to wrap up our conversation, I'm interested in your thoughts on what power means to you.
That's such a tough question.
It's very tough.
Oof. Okay. Well, to give a really as brief as I can answer, and I think in the context of this conversation, to me, it feels like power really is about those who can control and like shape others' beliefs, and that there's been a massive upset of that in the last decade or so with sort of the development of the online environment with emerging tech like AI, and sometimes it can be for good. So you can think about in open source intelligence terms, like all these really private civilians who've suddenly been able to make these incredible impacts on pushing back against disinformation. I mean, I know we did an event here, CSIS, with the NAFOs, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, and how they helped dismantle a lot of Russian disinformation in the early days of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And that's incredible. You know, they were able to help shape beliefs that way in a really positive way. Equally, flip side of that is now we're seeing this tech like deepfakes being used to negatively impact beliefs and really maliciously manipulate them, whether that's non-consensual pornography, whether that's, you know, a voice scam, AI voice scam to try to get money out of someone, whether that's trying to affect, you know, a situation geopolitically more broadly. And so I think that's, to me right now, power really seems to be focused on and relevant to those who can manipulate beliefs. And that whole dynamic is totally changing.
And Di, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
educating us about this critical issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.